I am Nathaniel Batchelder, and I'm a member of Americans Against the Next War. Incidentally, I'm the director of the Peace House, which is also a member organization of Americans Against the Next War. Americans Against the Next War is a coalition of local organizations and individuals that came together more than a year ago over concerns that a military strike by Israel or the U.S. against Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities could spark a full-scale war, possibly expanding into a regional conflict, disastrous for all sides. Through the year, we released regular reports that inspections taking place in Iran by the United Nations, the International Atomic Energy Agency, confirmed that Iran was enriching its uranium only to the low levels needed for nuclear power and medical purposes. In early spring, we had an opinion piece entitled "The U.S. Must Avoid Another Catastrophic War," published in the Tulsa World and the Oklahoma Gazette. Our efforts resulted in this piece being published on some 30 national websites of news organizations and peace groups around the country. Later last spring, we had this full-page ad published in the Tulsa World and Oklahoma Gazette. The ad quoted high-ranking military officials, including Secretary of State Leon Panetta and former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, strongly advising against any attack on Iran. A letter in the ad to President Obama with the same message was signed by 8 high-ranking active and retired military officials. Finally, we had 3 billboards erected on Interstate 40 and Interstate 35 carrying our message, "Tell Congress, no war on Iran." In the 5 months that they were up, these billboards were seen by millions of drivers, including cross-country traffic as well as Oklahomans. Today, we're announcing that our 3 billboards are now carrying a new message, and Hal Spake will speak about that. Hal Spake is an 11-year veteran of the United States military and is a retired U.S. diplomat. Good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hal.
Colonel Wilkerson, thank you for coming. Members of the press. The decision to expand our mission to that of bringing peace to the Middle East is best expressed by Martin Luther King, who said, "Violence is a way of achieving justice, is both impractical and immoral." Terrorism and the act of terrorism are marketing strategies that glamorize a product which sells the idea that the death of the innocent will lead to peace. However, we all know that if the marketers of armed conflict were honest and talked about the economic, cultural, psychological, and human cost of war, and televised the rendered bodies of victims, no one would buy their product. Our intelligence agencies tell us that the descending cycle of violence is unending if we fail to recognize that war and acts of terror are rooted in a desire for justice. They warn that the tendency to dismiss such attacks as nothing but pure evil contributes to our national insecurity. The world recognizes that our pursuit of bin Laden was just, but much of the world also knows there may have been some kernel of injustice that drew supporters to his cause. It's a sign of wisdom to recognize that actions may have unintended negative consequences that may result in injustice. It's a failure of logic to believe that war or terror are the only legitimate responses to injustice. To us, making peace in the Middle East means engaging all sides of a conflict in serious dialogue while seeking justice, life, liberty, and happiness for all. Gandhi said a society that embraces the philosophy of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth soon finds itself a society of the blind and toothless. As the Earth's last remaining superpower, one that cannot be toppled by the actions of a few reactionaries, our legacy should reflect this nation's core values, not the values of those who willingly raise the bloody hand of war.
Thank you, Hal. Our guest today, Lawrence Wilkerson, is Professor of Government and Public Policy at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. He served 31 years in the U.S. Army from 1966 to 1997. His final assignments included Special Assistant to then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Colin Powell, from 1989 to 1993. Later, he served at the U.S. State Department as a Chief of Staff to Colin Powell, 2002 to 2005. Colonel Wilkerson spoke yesterday at the University of Central Oklahoma and will speak this noon at the University of Oklahoma in Norman. We are grateful to him for speaking at our news conference today. Colonel Wilkerson.
Let me just say that the sign that's in front of me right here could be amended to say Americans Against War, period, and I'd be up here. A soldier of 31 years, I can tell you that the principal feeling of every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine, and Coast Guardsman, in essence, is to be against war unless it is the absolute last resort left to the nation. What does that mean? That means that you've exhausted your economic, financial, cultural, informational, diplomatic, and every other element of national power before you turn to the military. And basically it means that the fate of the nation is at stake. That is to say, it's got to be a pretty bad threat before soldiers, sailors, and others would sign up to going and do it, because they're the people who bleed and die on the battlefield. They're the people who now compose less than 1% of this 300+ million nation, and yet bleed and die on the battlefield for the other some 300 million. It's not a proposition to be taken lightly. In the proximate case here, in the case of the next war, and we're all talking about a war in Western Asia, yet another war in Western Asia, and with probably the most cohesive, nationally speaking, demographically, geographically, militarily powerful country in that region, Iran, is a specific case in point with its own credentials and its own requirements. If you want to read about what the cost of a war with Iran would be in a dispassionate analysis, read the one put out by the Iran Project, of which yours truly is a signatory, but more importantly is the big Brzezinski, Brent Scowcroft, Admiral Fox Fallon, General Tony Zinni, and a host of other national security elite are signatory to. It's called Weighing the Cost and Benefits of Military Action Against Iran. And in that dispassionate analysis, you find out some of the things that I'm really worried about with regard to what Secretary Gates, former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, said would be a catastrophic occasion for the United States and for the region, and certainly for Iran, upon whom the bombs would fall and ultimately the boots would invade. If you want to look even further into it, look at some of the comments that have been made by former Central Command commanders, those four-star generals and admirals who'd be in charge of carrying this action out. One of them, General Tony Zinni, said if you liked Iraq, you'll love Iran, and he didn't mean that in that literal sense. What he meant was, if Iraq was bad, 10 years, no real resolution to Iraq's problems, and a couple of $1 trillion, well, just sign up for Iran. Probably 10 to 12 years, no real resolution at the end, and another $2 to $3 trillion. Money that America can hardly afford to dedicate to yet another conflict in Western Asia. So my opposition to it is not just moral and ethical. My opposition to it is also physical and realpolitik. The United States simply does not need another war in Western Asia. Finally, there is no reason for this war. The other instruments of national power that we possess, principally at this moment, as the President has said, diplomacy, can effect a win-win solution to the current standoff between Iran, the European Union, others in the international community, and ultimately the United States. There is a solution out there. That solution has been handed to us twice, first by the Russians and then by the Turks and the Brazilians. We've refused to take that solution. We're meeting in Kazakhstan in February. I think it was first planned for the 25th. It's now, I believe, as I saw the news this morning, the 26th, where Saeed Jalili and Catherine Ashton, representing the P5+1, will sit down and resume these diplomatic talks. And there is no reason, if we're willing to give Iran the kind of negotiating position that we should, and they are willing to give us the kind of negotiating position that they should, there's no reason why these diplomatic talks can't come to fruition. What does that mean? In simple terms, it means exactly what the Turks and the Brazilians offered some years ago. It means that Iran doesn't enrich above a certain level that is not threatening, 3 to 5%. It means that anything she has enriched above that, up to 20% at the present time, is removed from the country. And it means that the IAEA establishes a rigorous and intrusive inspection regime, complete with cameras and boots on the ground for the IAEA, for some period of time, say 5 to 7 years, until the international community is more trusting of the leadership in Iran and more trusting that its nuclear program is indeed civilian. And let's just hearken back to when that program started. It was when we had our tyrant in charge in Tehran, the Shah, and we were even contemplating at the time giving that Shah nuclear weapons. Imagine if we'd gone through with that policy, what a dilemma we'd be in today as we sit back and prate about Iran and the irrationality of its current leadership, when for 26 years we essentially backed that leadership. The difference was the tyrant in charge then was our tyrant. The tyrant in charge now is not ours. If we look at this deal, and we look at it closely, we must be willing to offer, for what I just described, some quid pro quo that will be accepted by Iran. What might that be? Well, it won't be what we've done in the past, some aircraft parts for their airplanes. It has to be something substantial. It has to be something that gives them some hope with regard to the EU embargo on oil. And it has to be something like banking sanctions or financial sanctions in general. It has to be relief, at least for an interim period, until we can determine whether or not they're serious. In other words, diplomacy can succeed. But it has to be diplomacy on our side that is more than just sanctions, crippling or otherwise, and it has to be diplomacy on the Iranian side that is willing to trust us in terms of what we will do with regard to sanctions to give them some relief when they're giving us what we want with regard to their nuclear program. Final point, will we ever be convinced that Iran, under any regime, a Thomas Jefferson-looking democratic regime, for example, would not want to make a decision to weaponize from its civilian program and produce a nuclear weapon? No, we can't. There are no certainties like that in the world. Japan could build nuclear weapons at an awesome rate within a year of having made the decision. Pakistan is making nuclear weapons faster than any country in the world right now, every month turning them out, and is far more serious a threat if it becomes really unstable than Iran. North Korea is getting ready to test its second or third nuclear weapon. We don't seem to be up on our high horse about that. So why are we focused on this problem with Iran like a laser? Because it's all about power. It's all about power in the region. It's all about whether Israel will be the determiner of that power, whether Iran or Saudi Arabia and the GCC backed by the United States will be. It's time it became about preventing war. It's time it became about bringing Iran back into the international community as a responsible regional and global player. It's time that the United States and Iran settle some of their differences and move towards a better position with regard to their relations. It's time that this power struggle became a struggle, rather than for hegemony in the region, for peace and for commerce and for trade and for the benefit of all the surrounding nations like Turkey and all the GCC countries and Iraq, which we spent so much time and capital, resources, blood and treasure in. It's time we had peace in that region, and it's time that the Syrian business came to some sort of suitable end. It's not going to happen until there is a decent relationship between the real powerful country in the region, Iran, and the United States. Thank you.